So a big movement breaks out in the United States in the 1950s to try to find basically kind of communist terrorists throughout American society and weed them out and put them in jail or stop them from overthrowing the government or whatever they are supposedly planning to do. So you get a series of trials over spying, particularly related to nuclear secrets of the atomic bomb. And that grows and grows and grows. All right, so we'll start with that. It's not the first one I wanted, but okay. The United States government had been investigating communist activity since 1938. The Communist Party and the Socialist Party in the United States became very popular in politics because of the New Deal. Basically because a lot of people saw the Great Depression as a direct result of capitalism's failures and looked for an alternative. So many people in the United States read Karl Marx, or they joined the Communist Party or started voting communist or something like this. So it was a growing movement in the 30s, and that scared the U.S. government. So Congress set up an investigative body in 1938 to start looking for potential communist revolutionaries, basically. So this even predates World War II. That body was still investigating through World War II and after World War II, so it comes back into kind of power and popularity in government again as a result of the Cold War. President Truman, the leader of the Democratic Party, wasn't a great fan of this, but he realized, especially after Republicans win the 1946 midterm elections, that he has to give in to some of their Republican Party demands. And anti-communism was one of the big ones. Republicans demand the power to create lists of groups in the United States that they feel to be too dangerous. So Truman issues an executive order, 9835, that creates the power of the government to create basically an internal enemies list. A list of people and groups and movements to be watched within the United States for potential ties to communism or to foreign influence like the Soviet Union. So this is a big step toward the President of the United States kind of announcing to the American people that we have this problem with Soviet spies in the country. Truman may not have believed it so much, but it may have been just the result of political necessity. The Republicans are making a demand, and he has to compromise. So the FBI goes back to a heavy investigation of not just registered communist voters in the country, but their friends, their family members, and what the government generally calls communist sympathizers. People that are not registered communists, people that might not even go to communist meetings or own books written by communists or Karl Marx or anything like that, but people who might just in their own mind sympathize with communism or think communism might be a good solution, at least in part. So that widens the net dramatically. Not just to go after people who are, devoted communists, registered communists, leaders of a movement or something, but the whole rest of society that may just listen to communist ideas and debate them, that might be sympathetic to the idea. Does that make sense? So, that kind of definition can be expanded to almost virtually anybody. And if you ever checked out a book by Karl Marx from the library, you could become suspicious under that kind of definition. So that's really broadening the definition of a social threat pretty far and wide. The order also allowed state level and municipal governments to establish loyalty boards that would test the loyalty of people working for government or test the loyalty of people working in private companies that may have government contracts. So people working for companies that maybe building railroad lines to transport nuclear bombs across the country or something like this. People that have arms deals with the United States to make rifles for the U.S. Army or something. So these loyalty boards go into effect really to scrutinize their own employees and anyone who would apply for one of these types of jobs. All right. The biggest and most famous of these loyalty boards is the House Un-American Activities Committee. This is a committee in Congress of congressmen sitting on the committee that start running investigations into accused communists, looking for spies. It's called WHAC for short. So this is the body that's been around since 1938, have been running these kinds of investigations even long before World War II. But it comes back into power, comes back into popularity with the rise of the Cold War, especially after the Soviets get the atomic bomb. The idea in the United States is that the Soviets could only get the bomb by stealing secrets or by bribing Americans to turn over documents or something. That the Soviets aren't smart enough to do it themselves, to build something that technical, that advanced just by themselves. They have to corrupt the United States to get it. So a lot of the first investigations, or the new round of investigations, are directed against atomic physicists, people that work at the atomic laboratories that are actually building and researching the weapons. Does that make sense? And they do find some people. They find a couple spies that we'll talk about in a minute, but they also start going after people who don't even work for the government, that work in industries that have a big impact on American society. The most famous instance of this is when they start going after Hollywood writers and directors and actors. The U.S. government became concerned that Hollywood was producing movies that portrayed communism in a good light, as a viable option or even a favorable option. And of course, once Hollywood is threatened with being investigated by the FBI, they weren't making many of those movies at all, but they stopped making those movies completely. So the FBI investigations eventually went in and they looked at Hollywood movies to see if anyone is wearing a red tie in a movie, because red is the communist color. So if you have a main character wearing a red tie, that may be symbolically saying that this character is secretly a communist. And if he's the main character, like the hero of the movie, then that might be portraying communism as heroic. Does that make sense? And it's pretty far-fetched stuff. But the FBI investigates. They have interviews with Hollywood directors in the Hollywood studios. If they find what they feel is a suspicious film, they will go after the writers of the film, the creators of the thing, and accuse them of being closet communists, basically, trying to get subversive messages into American popular culture to subliminally convince the American population to support communism just by going to the movies. So this is pretty paranoid stuff. And a lot of Hollywood directors are put under pressure to name the writers of movies that are, putting those ideas in movies. And some directors did. They did what in the 50s was called naming names. They named the suspects in the group of writers or actors or whoever. They gave in to the pressure. Because the feeling amongst the studio leaders and the directors and many other leaders of different companies and industries was that if the FBI comes to you and says, we suspect your movie of being too pro-communist, we want to know who made that movie, who made those decisions to get those images in that movie. If you refuse to turn over that list of people, then the FBI suspects you of communism, because only a communist would want to help other communists hide. Does that make sense? So it's layers of paranoia. And careers are destroyed. Actors are blacklisted. Directors are blacklisted. Writers are blacklisted. Never allowed to work in Hollywood again because the studios don't want to have any association with anyone even accused of being pro-communist, ever. Does that make sense? This group of writers became known as the Hollywood 10. They were brought to Washington, D.C. and forced to testify to Congress, to the committee, the Congressional Committee. And they were told, under oath, to give over the names of their communist friends in Hollywood. And they refused. And they were jailed. They went to jail for several years for contempt of court for refusing to testify, refusing to hand over the list of their friends or their contacts or whoever. And of course, when they got out of jail, they were so tainted with the idea of communism that they never worked in Hollywood again. Their careers were completely eradicated. And it's not just this group, but it's other industries. Almost any industry the FBI goes after, workers in that industry become afraid, and the owners of companies, people in positions of power, often give in. And those that don't are themselves accused of communism. So they're afraid of just the accusation could destroy their career. And what do you do if you can't work in your chosen field where you've been trained, or maybe you've gone to college and gotten a degree to work in? What do? Go work in a factory somewhere for maybe a low wage or something, who knows. So this destroyed people's lives. And it was entirely just with the government threat of public accusation. So does all that make sense? Questions about this? No. That's all perfectly clear? All right. The government did find some communist spies. A few, not a whole lot. Definitely not enough to justify this massive search that they're doing across all companies, basically. One they do find is named Alger Hiss, and he is a worker in the State Department, which is the area that formulates U.S. foreign policy. That is the administration under the president that figures out what to do diplomatically, what demands to make, what negotiations to do, compromises, all this kind of stuff. And he was proven to have taken micro images, basically had a camera, a small camera, and he was taking pictures and copying documents from the State Department, internal debates within the U.S. government about foreign policy, and handing them to a Soviet spy. So the FBI suspected this guy, and then they followed him around for a while, and every once in a while this guy would go to a farm outside Washington, D.C., and particularly go through a pumpkin patch. And they found that he was taking microfilm, which is like you guys probably never see an actual canister of film in our digital age. But he was taking basically like a flash drive of documents and putting them inside a hollowed out pumpkin for the Soviet spy to come collect later on. So they caught him in the act. And this is a very famous picture of a U.S. congressman from California, Richard Nixon, who was one of the leaders of this investigation, taking the pictures, the film roll, out of the pumpkins and looking at them. So this was, front page news throughout the country. So this is where Richard Nixon came from. This is where he gets famous in American politics. So Alger Hiss goes on trial for espionage, and that's a pretty easy case. He's found guilty, and he's given a prison sentence. But the Alger Hiss trial seemed to prove to a lot of Americans that there are communist spies throughout American society, that this isn't just paranoia, that this is actually going on. So it's allowed to continue. The amount of Soviet spies in American society was very much smaller than most Americans were worried about. But this seemed to be proof on the front pages that the so-called Red Scare is justifiable. All right. And then they find another Soviet spy working in the atomic laboratories in New Mexico. This guy came from Germany. His name is Klaus Fuchs. He is discovered turning over atomic secrets to a Soviet spy in the United States. So the FBI, again, basically caught the guy in the act. And when they interviewed him, they demand that he name his Soviet contacts, the people in the Soviet spy ring in the United States, so the FBI could investigate those people. And Fuchs did name some people, and named a guy named Julius Rosenberg in New York City as one of the leaders of this Soviet spy ring. So the FBI turned its attention to Julius Rosenberg in New York and formulated a case of espionage against Rosenberg. And said the same thing to Rosenberg. We want to know who your Soviet contacts are. It now appears that Rosenberg was not a spy. He was an active communist. He went to Communist Party meetings. He read Communist Party newsletters and books and stuff like that. So he was an avowed communist, kind of activist in the United States, but he was not a spy, we now believe. But the FBI believed he was, so they put a lot of pressure on him to turn over information that he most likely did not have, including bringing charges against his wife for espionage also, saying that she was, involved in the spy ring. And the FBI eventually took him to trial and got these two found guilty of espionage and had them executed. So they went to the electric chair in 1953. So those were two very seemingly innocent victims of this massive amount of American paranoia. And again, they were found guilty in the court of public opinion. Americans were afraid. There were accusations against these two, and a lot of Americans didn't seem to want to believe that the government may have gone overboard. So just a mere accusation could destroy people, and definitely these two. Let's see. The next step in all this is after the Soviets get the atomic bomb in late 1949. A very little known senator from Wisconsin starts giving public statements in 1950 that he has run a personal investigation into the State Department. And he claims to know about over 200 State Department workers, advisors to the president, that are members of the Communist Party and might be Soviet spies. So he says this in 1950 in a midterm election year. And newspapers start running this like crazy. So overnight, Senator McCarthy becomes very, very famous. And seen as, one of two things. Either a guy who is massively paranoid and untrustworthy because he never presents any public evidence against people. He just keeps saying that he has a list of names. And that he's going to interview those people and find out who their Soviet contacts are. But he never presents any public proof that these people are guilty. So some Americans view McCarthy as massively paranoid and taking advantage of this culture of fear to promote his own career. Other Americans see him as a great patriot that is trying to root out evil from the country. So there's a lot of debate in American culture about McCarthy and what becomes known as McCarthyism, the power of accusation. He is eventually given control of a congressional committee to run his investigations. And one after another, he brings government employees in to testify, and he accuses them of being communists and asks them who their Soviet contacts are, and a whole bunch of them say, I'm not a communist. But just the mere accusation and the public demand that they testify destroyed these people's lives. Let's see. So McCarthy gets in control of the Senate, what's called the Senate Committee of Government Operations, which is basically investigating members of workers within the U.S. government of suspected communism and selling secrets to the Soviets. So he investigates the State Department. He investigates sometimes even other congressmen. He even investigates the leadership of the U.S. Army, the U.S. generals. At one point, he even said that General Eisenhower may have been a communist, which is like the most ludicrous thing. But just the accusation got him on the front pages. And people throughout the country were afraid of this guy. Because just pointing his finger at you could destroy your life. I mean, just the public accusation, your family members might not talk to you anymore. Your friends would disavow you. Your career would be over. So at the height of these accusations, nobody really wants to stand up to McCarthy. Because McCarthy basically says that anyone who tries to stop him in his investigations are probably communists themselves, because the only people that would stop him are the evil that wants to stay in hiding. Does that make sense? So newspaper editors were unwilling to take him on. Newspaper owners were unwilling to take him on. Other politicians avoided him, avoided saying anything about him, because they're so afraid of the mere accusation. But this is in the early days of television, where a lot of newspaper writers were becoming television reporters and getting their own like half-hour TV shows or something to talk about politics or news or whatever. So there's one guy named Edward Murrow who devotes an entire segment on one of his shows to going after McCarthy and talking about the downside of this and how it, Murrow says, is destroying the United States. So there's a video, a movie was made about this, Edward R. Murrow's attack on McCarthy. So here's a clip from the modern movie about it. So Murrow's theory is that it's not McCarthy's fault. McCarthy didn't create the situation. He didn't create the culture of fear and paranoia. That's something that the American people created for themselves. And that whenever this kind of paranoia exists where you attack each other just based on an accusation, that destroys the ability to debate, to come to a reasonable decision, and it gives power to people who just use fear to destroy their enemies. And McCarthy says it, or Murrow said that McCarthy is going against all the best traditions of the United States. That people should have the freedom of speech and the ability to not testify against themselves. And they shouldn't be jailed just on accusation, but only when they're proven guilty of something, according to evidence. So it's a very powerful argument. Murrow was only the first. These hearings that McCarthy is running are broadcast live on television during the daytime. So anybody watching this stuff, if you were wealthy enough to have a television in your house, which back then was a sign of wealth, anyone could watch this stuff basically all day. It was like a never-ending soap opera. And McCarthy, his personality was that whenever he felt threatened by outside, he would just ramp up the accusations even bigger. So in the end, he was accusing virtually all American leaders of being communists, one way or the other. Until one lawyer for one of the defendants that was forced to testify, this lawyer basically on public television humiliated McCarthy by being one of the first public people to say on live television that you have no evidence and that you're really just destroying people's lives to advance your own career. And McCarthy is immediately undone just with this public pronouncement in the courtroom. So McCarthy, in the wake of this accusation, his kind of house of cards collapsed, and he was censored by the Senate, which means that he was no longer allowed to talk on the Senate floor. He could vote, but he couldn't debate anymore. And in the next election, he lost his re-election, so his own voters kicked him out of the Senate. So he rose very, very fast to kind of the heights of American politics. He was one of the most powerful American politicians for several years, and then collapsed just as quickly. And died just a couple years after that. So he's dead by the end of the 50s. He became an alcoholic, drank himself to death. So this idea of accusation without evidence and intimidation just from accusation is today called McCarthyism. And other politicians have used this, or at least attempted to use this, to advance their own careers. Usually not very successful for the long term. But this just happened a few years ago when the United States was getting to invade certain countries, and certain politicians said that anyone who wants to stop this invasion, or anyone who's not supporting the invasion, must be a terrorist. So these kinds of accusations keep coming back in American culture. And it's happened repeatedly, not just recently, but it comes back in the 60s and 70s. All right, so questions about McCarthyism at all, or McCarthy himself? All right. Another big thing about the 1950s in the United States is economic. The United States goes into one of the greatest economic booms in human history. Many people feared when the U.S. went into World War II in 1941, 1942, that if the U.S. government became too closely tied to war spending, and the U.S. economy became completely dedicated to war production, that at the end of the war, the Great Depression would come back. And at the end of the war, Wall Street did go into a tailspin for a few days, and there was a recession at the end of the war, because the government didn't have to buy all those planes and bombs and bullets anymore. So those factories started laying off workers, and you get a recession. But very quickly after that, the American economy recovered and went into, again, one of the biggest booms in human history. The reason for that was American economic competition throughout the world had been destroyed. European factories were flattened in the war. Japanese factories were flattened in the war. Chinese factories didn't even exist yet, or in India. So the United States and southern Canada, big cities in Canada, were the only industrial centers that were not touched by the war. They were the only left standing. So if you wanted to buy something made in a factory in 1945, 1946, and going right through the early 50s, you bought it from an American company, because they're the only ones left. And in 1946, at the end of World War II, United States citizens or companies owned half the world's wealth. Half. 5% of the world population owned half of the resources. That's a height of power that hasn't been achieved since. And it's almost entirely because Europe, the Soviet Union, and Japan were destroyed in the war. So American companies start mass production of all kinds of things. And this is, again, where television comes into play. These American corporations become so astronomically profitable. They hire huge amounts of workers. They pay very high industrial wages for factory workers because there's a labor shortage. So labor unions are booming also. And they create this combination of corporate success and union success creates what we today think of as the middle class. A person who can go get a factory job and work 40 hours a week and afford to buy a house and a car and, food on the table and send kids to college and have some stability and have a pension and all that. These American corporations were so successful that they started monopolizing the American economy and the world economy. They expanded, started up networks in foreign countries all over the world. So U.S. corporations are astronomically profitable, and the leaders and even the middle managers of these corporations become very wealthy very quickly. And that creates, within the corporate workforce, a major competition to rise up the corporate ladder. So within companies, you get major competition amongst managers to rise to the next level. And the best way that they rise is to not be controversial. So people start dressing very much the same. They start talking very much the same. Everything becomes very conformist, because they don't want to upset their bosses by being kind of outlandish in any way. They don't want to be different. And they see that as the path to success in the corporate world. And it largely is in the 50s and also parts of the 60s. American society also gets driven even further into a consumer culture, where people start defining themselves according to how much money they make and how much stuff they can buy and the value of what kind of stuff they can buy. It becomes a big social status thing to buy the newest and most expensive car rather than just, some average car that'll get you down the road. People want to start buying flashy things to show off their wealth. And television, and that's what an early television looked like, cost a lot of money because they were rare. So they're very valuable. And rich people started buying them. And so the middle class started wanting to buy them to emulate the rich, which is something we often get in human societies across history and across geography. In American society, this became known as keeping up with the Joneses. So if you're living on a block of houses or in a bunch of apartments or something, it's the idea that if your neighbor's making more money and buying bigger and more expensive things, that you want to keep up with them socially, so you buy those same things. Does that make sense? And you see this in our society today with cell phones and cars and all kinds of things. The idea that something new has come out, so if you're going to remain at the cutting edge or have some kind of status, you have to buy the new thing. And it becomes cultural, to the point where it doesn't really matter what you're buying anymore. The technology or the objects you're buying aren't very much more useful than the old technology anymore. But it's the symbolic act of being able to afford it. Does that make sense? All right. Of course it does, because you live within it, right? It's everywhere. Another major success story for the American economy is whole new industries start using the assembly line process of production. Not just factories. The assembly line idea expands to much greater heights than it ever had before. And one of the earliest examples of this, in the late 40s and early 50s, was the creation of mass housing projects. What we today call the suburbs. Areas outside the urban center where the corporate or industrial centers are. Outside of, you say, downtown Los Angeles or something. Or midtown New York. Outside of the office buildings. Sometimes by many miles. But all these houses were built by one company, which is normal to us today, but was shocking back then. If you go into pre-50s Los Angeles and just look at the houses in those neighborhoods, they all look very different because they were built by one individual carpenter or one company that built one house. And the house next door was built by someone else. So they all had different floor plans, right? Have you ever seen these old houses, these old areas? They were different colors, it had different garage space, all kinds of things. They're just vastly different from each other. But when one company goes into this area of New York and they just level a huge amount of land, They build the exact same style house over and over and over and over again. You can see it just from the aerial view. The floor plans are all the same. They just alternate one house to another. This is A, this is B, this is A, this is B, right? And all these houses have, say, one garage. They have usually 3 bedrooms, a kitchen, 1 bathroom, an attached garage, a little backyard, a driveway, and a front yard with 1 tree. They were all exactly the same. They're all the same color. So this is a mass production process applied to housing. This company is very profitable because if you build the exact same style house over and over and over again, you know exactly how many materials you need, right? How many shingles for the roofs, how much piping for the plumbing, how many toilets. You just replicate it over and over again. And this is where Costco theory kicks in. This company would go to a supplier and buy a mass bulk of toilets. They buy thousands and thousands of toilets for a lower price, right? Because they're buying a huge amount of it. So they reproduce the exact same floor plan over and over and over again. They reproduce the exact same streets over and over again. You know, this street at the bottom looks the exact same as this street up here in the middle, as the exact same as this street up here at the top. And they usually have some kind of park or a school or something in the middle. And because they're mass producing things, just like if you go to Costco today, you buy something that is created in bulk, price is lower. So the price of these houses were far lower than individually built houses by one carpenter. Does that make sense? And with the new spending power that factory workers have through unionization, they can get mortgages very easily and can afford to buy a house. Whereas before the 1950s, the vast majority of Americans rented their living space. They either rented a home or an apartment. They didn't own. This stuff is all new in the 50s. And this becomes such a part of the culture that it's seen as heroic to be able to buy your own home, right? This is something that Americans aspire to own their own home under a mortgage. Does that make sense? It's still in our culture today. I mean, would you rather rent or own? It can be much less expensive to rent. But it's just something in our culture today, and this is where it starts. So this is called Levittown. This is one of the first mass suburban areas. And this was psychologically shocking to people. People that were used to living in neighborhoods where the houses look different, and they can easily, find landmarks to find their way home. When people first moved in, they would go driving home down the street, and they'd get lost. They couldn't find their house. They couldn't find their street because everything looks the exact same. Which to us is funny and weird because we're so used to living in this madness, this mass conformity. Walk outside your apartment building, your house, and just look up and down the street. All crap looks the same, right? Because it's all built by one builder, replicated over and over. But it was shocking to the people back then. And they got lost on their way home. They had to go into some neighbor's house and call their house and find out how to get home. So this is a big change for American society. They also start mass production of food. And this is where the fast food industry comes in. The McDonald brothers up here in San Bernardino, the first McDonald's store, which I think is still there today. They figured out how to quickly make food for sale on an assembly line tactic. And if you've ever worked fast food, it is still an assembly line tactic. There are stations in order, in a pre-planned mechanism to make the stuff as fast as possible. And these guys became wealthy because they could make food faster. If you're hungry, you can go into their restaurant and you didn't have to wait 20 minutes for the food to be cooked. You can go in there and get your food in 5 or 10 minutes. They were more efficient, more people went there, and because they're making the food off a mass production assembly line process, they buy the materials in bulk so they can sell their food cheaper. The McDonald brothers they're the original owners a corporate guy came to them and bought their idea. So he bought them out, and they went away. And the McDonald's we know today, the corporate guy just repeated the process and just built more stores. So McDonald's is what it is today. The original corporate advertising slogan for McDonald's was to give mom her break today. The idea that cooking dinner for a family is tedious, it's a lot of work. So instead of making mom do that every single meal, take your family to McDonald's and mom doesn't have to work so much for a day. There's one meal that mom doesn't have to cook. So it's seen as helping, the mom, which everyone wants to help their mom, right? So they took advantage of that psychologically to get people to drive to the store and buy this stuff. And even a few years ago, maybe 10 years ago, the slogan was, "Have you had your break today?" So it's still a part of the slogan, but not really so much anymore. They're mostly advertising based on the idea that they're selling you sugar, fat, and salt, basically. And people love it for some reason. I don't know. But, that's how... What's the slogan now? I can't remember. Yeah, for McDonald's.
I'm loving it.
Oh, I'm loving it. It's completely divorced from anything logical. Just, I love McDonald's. I love McDonald's, so you should love McDonald's too. I don't know. But, that's what advertising eventually gets you to. Okay, but again, it's the mass production process now put into food. This is also the point where retail stores come into effect. Big grocery stores, supermarkets, come in the 1950s into the American suburb, where you can go in and you can go into, say, a Stater Brothers in Ontario, and you can go into a Stater Brothers in West Covina. Their floor plan's exactly the same. It's mass production. You know exactly where stuff is. Does that make sense? So it's a repetitive process over and over again. And the repetitive creation builds efficiency, buying in bulk, lower prices, and these corporations become hugely successful. So by the late 50s, early 60s, most people in the United States are buying their food through a supermarket system or through a fast food type of system. The old family-owned grocery store on the corner is gone for the most part. And it hasn't come back. And it's been repeated in hardware and all kinds of things much more recently. We've talked about that before, right? Yes? No?
Yeah.
When Home Depot and Lowe's came to this area, all the family-owned places disappeared within a few years. Yeah. Okay, so retail stores come into existence. Same exact thing. Another interesting thing is there's so much prosperity amongst the middle class that they start giving their kids what they call an allowance, like a few dollars a week or a month or something like that for doing chores, which was a revolutionary idea for a lot of people back then. It is showing off prosperity to give your kids some money. And remember, the middle class of the 1950s, the factory workers of the 1950s, were born in the 20s. They were teenagers during the Great Depression, during times of starvation. They were in their 20s during World War II. So this is a generation that has lived through catastrophe. And now as they're middle-aged adults in their 30s and 40s by the 1950s, a lot of historians write that psychologically they had been through the catastrophes in their early years. And psychologically they may have just wanted some kind of stability. So many of them love the idea of mass conformity and mass production, where everything is looking the same, because it's not threatening. These people had lived through great threats to their lives. And many of them, if you ever met my grandparents, man, they were mass conformists. They absolutely were. They didn't want to do anything different from the rest of anyone else. I mean, one of my grandparents used to say when she'd get mad, it's just not what people do. Like, that's how she would criticize someone. You're not doing what everyone else does. But she grew up in this kind of psychology of depression and warfare. But the idea of having enough money to give to your children, even if it's a little bit, as we would think of it today, this idea of giving children an allowance is a revolutionary idea to these people who grew up in times of poverty. So you suddenly have a much kind of younger spending spree going on amongst teenagers. And this is where the modern idea of teenagers comes from in the 50s, where they suddenly have this money and they start going to movies, they buy music, they all do all kinds of these cultural things. And so the companies or the artists or the musicians or whoever who could dedicate their image or their creations to a teenage audience became very wealthy very, very fast. So Americans are spending more money on what we call leisure activities. They're not only buying cars and clothes, like things they think they need, but they're going to baseball games. Baseball becomes hugely prosperous in the 50s because people have more money to spend on just relaxing, on entertainment. Hollywood makes a big comeback. And, of course, the big teenage audience are more what you would think of as revolutionary type people, like Elvis Presley, who dressed like a conformist, right? Suit and tie and all that, but danced a little too wildly for the parents, and, of course, anything that parents don't like, teenagers love. Right? And if you listen to his songs, they don't seem very revolutionary in any way. But some of the lyrics glorify people in prison for having rebelled against society. They talk about, going out and having a wild time and, stuff that parents generally don't like even today. But Elvis Presley was a revolutionary figure to a lot of the younger audience. And there's a full-time instructor at this college who was a kid in the 1950s. And he'll tell you, he can remember when Elvis was allowed on TV. That was like a big turning point. Because a television station realized that there's enough teenagers out there that'll watch their show if they put Elvis on to make that company a lot of money. So they took the risk. And this guy will tell you, I was a kid, and me and my sister were watching Elvis on TV, and my dad had his finger on the power button, that in case Elvis started dancing too much, he'd shut it off. It's just too much. Can't handle it. So Elvis, in his early days, was a very kind of cultural revolutionary type figure. And you got a lot of them also kind of Elvis impersonators in movies. I mean, Elvis made movies too. But you get the James Deans and the Marlon Brandos of the 1950s who rebel against parents' advice or something like this. And some of them say they just rebel in order to rebel because they don't like the conformity. Elvis's stature as a revolutionary type of cultural figure disappeared when he was drafted into the army and willingly went in. He didn't run away. He didn't burn his draft card or anything. He went into the U.S. Army. So his status as a kind of, anti-cultural type of person pretty much disappeared after that. Right? You can't be a revolutionary and join the U.S. Army. Right? I don't think so, at least. But I guess you guys disagree with me. That's fine. Let's see. But Elvis is just the most popular, most visible. Elvis was not a big intellectual. Elvis didn't write books. Elvis didn't come up with a giant revolutionary theory. He didn't describe it very much. He just kind of rode the wave of it. And he was aware of his image as a kind of cultural icon for rebelling against the parents' society, the adult society. But he never really came up with a grand theory of why he's doing or what he's hoping to accomplish. He was just getting rich off it. There were other artists and intellectuals who do write books and music, and eventually movies, directly critiquing the cultural system and especially the mass conformity. And they do give statements about what they hope to accomplish. In the 1950s, they were called the Beats, the Beat generation. They are writers, they are novelists, they write articles, they are intellectuals. And they also write songs and movies eventually, by the 60s. The most famous of them are Jack Kerouac, up here in the top right, who wrote a book called On the Road, which, if you've ever read it or seen, there's even a recent version of the movie that came out. Basically, it's like two guys and maybe a couple other friends get in a car, and instead of going to school at Harvard or Yale, or I think this character is at Columbia, which is in New York City, instead of going to school for a few weeks, they just get in the car and they drive across the country. And they said that doing that is more freeing and intellectually stimulating than going to school and reading books. They say that going out and meeting the average people in the country and taking part in different parts of the culture. They go and they work as apple pickers in an orchard with Hispanics in California. They go into black dive bars and listen to jazz, which is black music back then that white society was trying to keep out and stop their kids from listening to. They say they learn more about life, they live life more than they would just going to a university and reading books and talking to their teachers. And they have, I think, a pretty good argument. That's why they call themselves the Beats. Especially Kerouac was obsessed with the jazz beat, because a jazz beat can change quickly. It's improvised. It's not written down. It's not solid. And that's what he wanted life to be. He wanted life to be adventurous, fairly wild, not tied down. Does that make sense? The downside for Kerouac and a lot of his kinds of ideas is they also became heavily involved in alcohol and drugs. And Kerouac eventually died of liver damage. He was an alcoholic. But he wrote wild things, and he said that he lived life more than basically anyone of his generation, and he loved it. So he went off on all these kind of adventures and wrote books about them, and he developed a kind of group of musicians and other writers who traveled with him and wrote similar kinds of stories. Allen Ginsberg, and eventually by the 60s, Hunter S. Thompson, who wrote really some of the most wild things you're ever going to see out of the Beat generation. But also became very heavily involved in drugs and alcohol and whatnot. Probably the most famous musician that gets involved in this in the Beat generation is Bob Dylan, a folk singer who started writing songs complaining about the U.S. government, complaining about McCarthyism. One of the first intellectuals in the United States to openly say that what happened to Native Americans was a genocide and an evil thing. He's one of the first intellectuals in the United States to ever say that the natives had been wronged and that the American government had done evil things to them. So he is very controversial in the 50s. Wrote songs about protesting against government, about voting against certain congressmen, and all kinds of things. So he becomes a kind of musical leader of the Beat generation. So their message is anti-conformity. Live your own life, make your own individual decisions. And don't live life just to make money and have stuff. And they say that that is unfulfilling. Does that make sense? All right. Questions about the Beats at all? This message, when you get into the mid-1960s, this message morphs into the hippie generation. We'll talk more about them later. We'll go even further into drug experimentation and all kinds of alternative lifestyles and stuff. But, we're still in the 50s, so we'll stop there.